Hello guys, welcome to my channel where stories filled with revenge, moral lessons and love are told. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more. The memory of that day still makes my heart pound. We were only a few miles from the Canadian border, driving in quiet anticipation of a family reunion I hadn't attended in years. My husband Ethan sat in the passenger seat, unusually still, his hand pressed against his thigh as though holding back words. The kids were dozing in the back seat, their soft breathing filling the space with an innocence I desperately wanted to protect. Then, almost like a whisper from fate itself, Ethan leaned closer and said, "Clara, turn the car around." Now. I blinked at him, startled, thinking maybe he was joking. His voice wasn't loud, but there was no trace of humor. His tone was clipped, serious, urgent. I gripped the wheel tighter. "What? We're so close. Why?" He reached toward the duffel bag that my parents had insisted we take along, supposedly filled with gifts for relatives in Toronto. Ethan unzipped it slightly and then zipped it right back up, his eyes cutting to mine. "Just turn around," he repeated. I had known him long enough to recognize when his instincts screamed danger. So I swallowed my questions and pulled off the highway, making a sharp U-turn that sent the children stirring in their seats. For the next 20 minutes, silence pressed down on us, broken only by the sound of the tires rolling over asphalt. My palms grew clammy, my mind racing. I wanted to demand answers, but Ethan's expression told me to wait. When we pulled into a quiet rest area, he finally opened the bag fully. Nestled beneath neatly folded sweaters and boxes of cookies were several vacuum-sealed packages, opaque and heavy. My stomach flipped. "Ethan, what is that?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer in some unspoken corner of my mind. He looked straight at me and said, "Clara, this isn't food. This is drugs. Your parents tried to use us." The world tilted. I remember gripping the edge of the car seat so hard my nails dug into the fabric. My parents, Martin and Sylvia, had always had a way of pushing boundaries, of bending morals to fit their own desires. But this was beyond anything I imagined. Images of Border Patrol officers opening our trunk flashed in my head. The thought of my children being dragged into that nightmare was unbearable. My throat tightened as I whispered, "They could have destroyed us." Ethan nodded grimly. "And they would have slept fine at night." I couldn't bring myself to cry. My tears seemed frozen behind a wall of shock and betrayal. I thought back to the phone call a week earlier, when my mother had chirped in her usual sweet tone, "Clara, darling, could you help us with a small favor? Just a bag for your uncle's family. You know how hard it is for us to travel these days." She had layered it with guilt, painting herself as fragile and needy. I hadn't questioned her. I wanted to believe. I wanted to still be the dutiful daughter, who could smooth the family's rough edges. But sitting in that car, with Ethan's hand firm on my shoulder, reality sank its claws deep. My parents weren't fragile. They were calculating. They had chosen to risk not just me, but my husband and our children, for their selfishness. I stared at the packages in horror. My voice shook as I asked, "What do we do now?" Ethan's reply was steady, calm, almost rehearsed. "We take it back. We put it exactly where it came from. And then, Clara, we decide if we ever let them near us again." The drive back to my parents' house was the longest of my life. Every mile felt like a confrontation waiting to happen. My chest burned with anger, but underneath the fury was something colder. Shame. How could I not have seen this coming? How many little red flags had I ignored over the years? I remembered birthday dinners where my father would talk big about his business ventures, even as creditors circled. I remembered the way my mother would dismiss any question with a laugh, saying, "Don't worry, Clara, things always work out for us." They worked out because someone else, usually me, picked up the pieces. When we pulled into their driveway, my hands were trembling so hard I could barely shift into park. Ethan carried the bag inside. My parents were waiting in the living room, glasses of wine in their hands as though nothing in the world was amiss. "You're early," my father said with a forced cheeriness that now felt sinister. Ethan set the bag down in the center of the room with a heavy thud. "We're not going," he said flatly. My mother's smile faltered. Her eyes flicked to me, searching for control, for the old Clara who would smooth things over. But I stood rooted in place, silent, watching the facade crumble. "Clara," my mother began, her voice sugary and manipulative. Surely there's some misunderstanding. Ethan cut her off. There's no misunderstanding. We opened the bag. We saw what was inside. You tried to use us, to use your grandchildren to traffic drugs across a border. The word grandchildren echoed in the air like a curse. My father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. My mother's face hardened into something colder than stone. She whispered, "We only asked for one favor. After everything we've done for you." Her words stabbed deeper than the revelation itself. After everything they had done for me? What they had done was place the weight of their world on my shoulders since I was old enough to carry it. What they had done was use guilt and obligation as chains, calling it love. My voice came out low, trembling but firm. "We're done. Don't call. Don't come near the kids. This ends now." My mother opened her mouth to protest, but Ethan took my hand and guided me out before the poison could sink any deeper. As we drove away, the children still half asleep in the back, I realized something had shifted permanently inside me. It wasn't just about the drugs. It was about decades of being pulled into their chaos, of covering for their bad decisions, of sacrificing pieces of myself to maintain an illusion of family. For the first time, I allowed myself to think, maybe I didn't owe them anything anymore. Maybe walking away wasn't betrayal, it was survival. That night, lying awake beside Ethan, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the rhythm of his breathing. My body felt heavy, but my mind was racing. The betrayal was raw, burning in my veins, but beneath it flickered a fragile spark of freedom. I whispered into the dark, almost to myself, "I can't let them near us again." Ethan squeezed my hand without opening his eyes. "Then we won't," he said. It was that simple. And yet, it was the hardest decision I had ever made. I wish I could tell you that leaving that bag on my parents' living room floor was the end of it. But life is never that neat. When Ethan and I drove away that evening, I felt both liberated and shattered. I couldn't stop thinking about how many years I had willingly played the part of their shield. I had carried their shame like it was my own, cleaned up their messes, and made excuses for their behavior to relatives, neighbors, even friends. And all of it started long before that drive to the border. Growing up, my parents Martin and Sylvia wore respectability like armor. Our house always looked pristine from the outside, with freshly painted shutters and a manicured lawn. But inside, I knew how thin that picture-perfect veneer really was. I remember being 12 years old and overhearing my father arguing with debt collectors on the phone, his voice rising in anger as he promised money that wasn't there. I remember my mother whispering to me that I shouldn't repeat what I heard, because people wouldn't understand. That phrase became a mantra in our house. People wouldn't understand. It meant hide the truth, keep smiling, keep pretending. By the time I was a teenager, I had become their fixer. When the electricity was about to be cut off, I was the one who called and begged for an extension. When my father's business partners showed up at the door looking for repayment, I was the one who smoothed things over with a calmness I didn't actually feel. My parents praised me for being responsible, as if it was a gift rather than a burden they had strapped to my back. And because I loved them, I carried it. I didn't realize until much later that their praise was just another chain keeping me in place. Fast forward to adulthood, and the pattern hadn't changed much. When Ethan and I got married, my parents immediately leaned into me for help. At first it was small things, watching my nephew so my sister Renee could work, covering for my mother when she forgot to pay bills. But soon the requests became bigger, heavier. The breaking point before the border incident came when they asked us to pay for my nephew's private school tuition. It wasn't a suggestion, it was presented as an expectation. My mother even said, "Clara, you know your nephew's future depends on this. Don't you want to be the kind of aunt who invests in the family?" Ethan and I had just finished saving for a down payment on our house. We couldn't afford to drain our savings for something that wasn't our responsibility. So for the first time, I said no. My father's response was a stony silence that lasted weeks. My mother wept into the phone, accusing me of abandoning family when they needed me most. I held my ground, but inside I felt sick. I thought refusing them might finally push them to stand on their own. Instead, I realized later, it only pushed them to more desperate lengths, like using us as unsuspecting mules. After we confronted them about the drugs, Ethan and I tried to set firm boundaries. I blocked their numbers for a while. But boundaries, to people like my parents, were just challenges to break down. The first sign came when my children's school called me one afternoon. "Mrs. Hart," the receptionist said, "your parents are here to pick up the kids. Is that correct?" My blood went cold. I had given no such permission. I raced to the school, and sure enough, Martin and Sylvia were waiting in the parking lot, gifts spilling out of their arms, smiling like nothing was wrong. I pulled the kids to me and snapped, "You can't do this. You don't have permission." My mother looked wounded, clutching a toy robot in her hands. "Clara, darling, don't be so dramatic. We just wanted to surprise them. Grandparents should be allowed to spoil their grandchildren." My father chimed in with a cool edge. "You can't keep them from us forever. They'll grow up and make their own choices." The arrogance of it nearly broke me. They truly believed they could buy their way into my children's hearts, manipulating them the same way they manipulated me. That night, Ethan and I sat at the kitchen table, the kids tucked safely in bed, and had the hardest conversation of our marriage. He looked me in the eye and said, "Clara, this isn't just about you anymore. They're targeting the kids now. We can't let this continue." His voice was steady, but his jaw was tight with anger. I wanted to argue, to cling to the hope that my parents might change, but deep down I knew Ethan was right. Protecting my children meant cutting off my parents completely. Within a month, we packed our lives into boxes and moved to North Carolina. It was far enough away to make unannounced visits nearly impossible, but close enough to give us a fresh start without losing everything we'd built. The move was both painful and liberating. I cried while taping up boxes, grieving the family I wished I had but never truly did. At the same time, I felt a weight lifting. For the first time in my life, I was choosing myself, choosing my husband, choosing my children. Still, the fear lingered. I worried about the phone calls, the letters, the sudden appearances. I worried about whether cutting them off would make me the villain in family lore, painted as the ungrateful daughter who abandoned her parents. The silence that followed was both eerie and loud. For months, there were no calls, no unexpected visits. I began to believe maybe they had finally backed off. Maybe they had found someone else to manipulate. But then came the email from my sister Renee. It arrived late at night, and I stared at her name on the screen for several minutes before opening it. The subject line was simple: "Please help." Her message was frantic, desperate. "Our parents had been arrested," she wrote, "caught at the border themselves this time, attempting to carry packages they thought no one would question." She pleaded with me to send money for a lawyer, to help cover the costs, to do the right thing as the eldest daughter. I read it twice, my stomach twisting into knots. My sister wasn't just asking for help, she was asking me to step right back into the role I had spent my whole life trying to escape. I closed my eyes and took a shaky breath. I could almost hear my mother's voice in Renee's words. "Clara, this is your responsibility. You can't turn your back on us now." But I also saw Ethan's face, and the faces of my children, their safety and stability hanging in the balance. That night, I typed a response that made my hands tremble. I showed up once. I'm not doing it again. Then I clicked send. After I sent that email to Renee, the silence that followed was like a final curtain falling. Days passed, then weeks, and no reply came back. I thought maybe she had decided to cut me off too, angry at my refusal to step in. But a part of me also wondered if, in the quiet, she understood. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of my parents' chaos on my shoulders. I wasn't running to patch up their disasters or emptying my pockets to keep their illusions alive. I was simply living, breathing in the North Carolina air, walking my children to school, building a life with Ethan that was finally ours alone. But peace never comes without echoes. I'd be folding laundry, and suddenly my mind would drag me back to childhood. Those times when my father would boast about his business, at the dinner table, spinning tales of success while my mother played the perfect hostess, laughing at jokes that weren't funny. I'd remember being a little girl, standing in the kitchen doorway, sensing the truth beneath the glitter, but too young to name it. Those echoes carried shame and anger, but also something else, clarity. I saw now how every smile, every gift, every promise had been bait to keep me tethered to their needs. They had dressed manipulation as love. The news of their sentencing came not from Renee, but from a cousin who still lived near our old town. She called me one afternoon, her voice trembling with the weight of gossip and grief. "Clara," she whispered as though sharing a forbidden secret, "they've been convicted. For years in federal prison." For years. It didn't sound like much compared to the wreckage they had nearly caused, but it was enough to make me sit down hard at the kitchen table, my hands suddenly weak. When I hung up the phone, Ethan looked at me with concern. I told him the news, and he simply nodded. There was no celebration in his face, no smug "I told you so." Only quiet understanding. He wrapped his arms around me, and I pressed my forehead against his chest. "I feel like I should be crying," I whispered. "But I don't have tears left for them." Ethan stroked my hair and said softly, "That's because you already grieved them long ago." The children were too young to understand the full scope of what had happened, but they sensed my heaviness. One night, my daughter slipped into my lap and asked, "Mom, why don't we see Grandma and Grandpa anymore?" Her eyes were wide, innocent, unscarred by betrayal. I pulled her close and whispered, "Because sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most make choices that aren't safe. And my job is to keep you safe." She nodded slowly, accepting my answer without needing more. That was enough for now. Still, in the quiet hours of the night, guilt would creep in like a shadow. What kind of daughter abandons her parents when they're in prison? What kind of sister refuses to help when blood begs for it? But every time those questions tried to burrow into me, I remembered the image of that duffel bag in my car. I remembered how easily my parents had risked the lives of their grandchildren. And I remembered Ethan's whisper, "Turn the car around." Now, that whisper had saved us, and I refused to forget it. Months passed, and Renee finally wrote to me again, this time with a tone less desperate, more resigned. She told me she had scraped together money from friends to pay part of the legal fees, and that the rest of the family was disappointed in me. She wrote, "They all think you've abandoned us." I sat staring at her words, my chest tight, but I didn't reply. Because maybe I had abandoned them, but only in the sense that I had abandoned a burning house I had been forced to live in my entire life. And when a house is on fire, you don't stay inside just because your family built it. You get out, and you save the ones you can. Life in North Carolina slowly began to feel like home. We found a church community where no one knew our history. Ethan's job flourished, and I picked up a part-time role at the library that made me feel alive again. My children laughed more freely, no longer caught in the tug-of-war of gifts and guilt from my parents. For the first time, our days weren't marked by crisis. They were marked by small joys, pancake breakfasts, soccer games, lazy evenings on the porch. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch watching the sun dip low, I thought about the story my life had become. I thought about how my parents' choices had once defined me, but no longer did. I thought about the moment I refused to send money for their lawyer, and how that single act of defiance had rippled through everything. And I realized something important. My story wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation. I had reclaimed my life, my marriage, my children's future. I had broken a cycle that would have swallowed us whole. When people hear my story, some say I was too harsh. Others say I should have cut them off long before. But to me, it isn't about what outsiders think. It's about the moment I chose safety over obligation, love over guilt, truth over illusion. And if you've ever been in a situation where family demanded your loyalty at the expense of your well-being, then maybe you understand. Sometimes survival looks like betrayal. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is turn the car around. So I leave you with this. Family is more than blood. Family is the people who protect you, who don't gamble with your future, who don't place their burdens on your back. And if you find yourself at a crossroads, with someone whispering for you to turn around, maybe you should listen. Because that one choice might save your life too. Moral lesson. Life will often test the boundaries between loyalty and survival. I learned the hard way that love without respect is manipulation, and that obligation without safety is bondage. By choosing to walk away from parents who cloaked their selfishness as family duty, I discovered a deeper truth. Protecting my children and honoring my own worth was the greatest act of love I could offer. If you are listening to this story and find yourself tangled in toxic expectations, I want you to remember you are allowed to choose peace. You are allowed to choose safety. You are allowed to break the cycle, even if it means walking away from the people who raised you. It does not make you heartless. It makes you brave. And to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and share it with your friends. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in my place. Do you think I went too far or not far enough? Your voice matters here, and together, we can learn from each other's stories.